Walking along a path at the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road toward the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a riotous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether the fairy lady you found in your father's old desk is a portent of good or ill. In a corner by the fire are two people. One of them is looking back and forth between his copy of George MacDonald and his copy of Susanna Clark. And that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal: a renaissance of the Christian imagination. To find out more about who we are and what we do, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. Also, take a look at our other podcast, Redeemed Imagination, which is launching again after laying dormant for a while. You know, one of those seeds that'll lay dormant for a while, then like spring up. I read about that in science somewhere, but it's going and it's going to be great. And while you're at it, why not rate and review this show on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Really appreciate it. Helps us out a lot. And when I found out about this project that we're going to discuss, I was very, very excited because I think it is a perfect marriage of two forms that will work very well together. And it's a work of art that I've been stewing over for a very long time, just constant stewing. And I cannot wait to stew with you, the listener, for this full length of the podcast. And for that, it's to our friends at Cave Pictures Publishing. Folks who've listened to the podcast before know we've had several folks related to them on the podcast. They always have super interesting projects. So I am always interested to see the Cave Pictures, especially interested to see this one because of what we will be discussing. And to discuss this project, it is Mandi Hart with Cave Pictures. Mandi, how are you?
I'm great and excited to have a conversation tonight about Phantastes.
Absolutely. So, Mandi, before we launch into Phantastes and I get to some of my stewing, maybe tell us, remind us a little bit about who you are and what you do with Cave Pictures.
Sure. So I am the president of Cave Pictures Publishing, which draws its name and ethos from Plato's allegory of the cave and the idea of being a wall for modern myth-making. All of the comics and graphic novels that we produce are good, true, and beautiful content pointing beyond the shadows that we see in this world to the real concrete things that are beyond sight and sound and touch, and just seeking to be pointing towards truth and towards light. So we're also definitely draw a lot of inspiration and instruction from the Inklings writers as well, and George MacDonald as a formative influence for many of those writers and kind of who Lewis called his master. We look to George MacDonald quite a bit in our creative work as well.
All right. Awesome. And yeah, once again, seriously, listeners, if you like the things that we talk about with the Anselm Society, you're going to love Cave Pictures. So go to their website, check out their stuff. Lots of super interesting stuff going on. And Mandi, one small point I'd like to address before we get in. You have a law degree, right? Like,
I do. Yes.
I do as well. So just to all of you lawyers out there, you can do you can practice law and you can also do art stuff too. They're not mutually exclusive. How did that all link together?
Well, I was in filmmaking before I went to law school. So my background is really coming out of the world of film. And I got my MFA in film production and direction several years ago now, and worked for a couple years in documentary filmmaking before going to law school. And from day one in law school, I knew that I wanted to come back into creative content and was just seeking the experience and the skills to be more involved on the financing, production, legal, and business structuring side of creative content. So that's, even though it seemed like a detour at the time, it was purposeful. And in retrospect, God has brought the threads of several things in my life and experience, brought them together really beautifully in Cave and in some of the other work that I do.
Absolutely. Well, I'm just thrilled that you've been able to take the helm of this, and I'm just really, really impressed with all the stuff y'all have been doing. So let's go to Phantastes in particular now. So you touched on this a little bit already, but let's discuss this more, because Phantastes is maybe the most famous work by George MacDonald, who is a writer from the middle part of the 19th century. And you're absolutely correct that he was absolutely formative for the Inklings. You can almost think of him as like the proto-Inkling, because he inspired so many folks. But he has a following today, and the people who know about him love him. But he's not nearly as widely known as Lewis, Tolkien, and a lot of the other Inklings. So tell us a little bit about George MacDonald himself. What drew you to him as a writer?
Yeah, so he's such a fascinating and prolific author. One thing I've not yet dived into that I want to dive into is any of his sermons, because I've read so much of his fiction and listened to so much of his fiction that I'm just fascinated with what sort of preacher was he, and some of his theological writings, because there's so much, just theological truth, such great truth written in concise and clear ways in so much of his fiction writing, that I'm intrigued by his output as a theologian and a preacher. But he, in some ways, created a genre, the fairy genre. He was such a trailblazer in that sense. And for a theologian and a pastor to have had that sort of influence in the world of literature is really unique and fascinating. So it's mostly the quality of his fiction and how evocative it is, how packed with truth. I feel like there's so many short lines that he puts into the context of either dialogue with characters, the narrator making an observation, that you just have to kind of stop and wait. I just need to think on that and sit with that for a minute. And I think that's one of the things that makes him such an intriguing and powerful figure for us, and one of the things that drew us to his work in wanting to do some adaptations of George MacDonald's fiction and try to bring it to a modern audience, particularly those that are so well-versed in Lewis and Tolkien and may not know or be very unfamiliar with MacDonald and everything that he did.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll include myself in that to a large extent. As a member in good standing of Anselm, I know a ton about, Lewis and Tolkien's work. I read Phantastes shortly around college age. I've tried some other stuff, but I don't know him nearly as well. And that's something, just preparing for this episode, I was like, oh man, I need a fix, because like you said, his influence on later writers, it's incredible. There's obviously, you mentioned Lewis already. I'm just reading a quote that he has in an introduction to a MacDonald sermon anthology. And C.S. Lewis says, "My own debt to this book is almost as great as one man can owe to another, and nearly all serious inquirers to whom I have introduced it acknowledge that it has given them great help, sometimes indispensable help toward the very acceptance of the Christian faith." And then he goes on later, "In making this collection, I was discharging a debt of justice. I have never concealed the fact that I regarded him as my master. Indeed, I fancy I have never written a book in which I did not quote from him. But it does not seem to me that those who have received my books kindly take even now sufficient notice of the affiliation. Honesty drives me to emphasize it." Like, even in Lewis's day, he's like, guys, this guy's amazing. I owe so much to him. Please read him. And still, we still have this issue with MacDonald. And then like I was reading G.K. Chesterton talked about reading one of MacDonald's books, quote, "made a difference to my whole existence." He was also a mentor of Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland. It's like, like you said, he founded a whole genre of literature. This dude was so important, and we've forgotten about him. So needless to say, I'm very happy you all are doing this project. So now let's focus in on Phantastes in particular. What got this on the radar of Cave Pictures to think, okay, this would be a good project for us?
Yeah. So we previously did an adaptation of The Light Princess, which was kind of our first foray into MacDonald. Light Princess, for those that are familiar with the gospel, it's a very, what I would say is a very clear allegory of the gospel account and just the power of sacrificial love and particularly sacrificial death. And that one, it was more accessible to a wide age range. So that was an easier kind of first outing into MacDonald, but we enjoyed it so much and had such a wonderful experience working with Meredith Finch in particular on that adaptation. I mean, she just nailed it. It kind of became an inside joke within our team. And every time she would deliver a script, we had very little feedback beyond just, this is great, we love it. Like we have nothing, not much substantive to say or to change. And she just from the very get-go really grasped the theme and held it consistent throughout the entire adaptation. So when it came time to kind of pick the final title in our first slate of works that we were going to publish, we talked about returning to MacDonald. And early on, we had done kind of an audit of several of his works and thinking about what translates or would translate well into a more visual medium. And Phantastes, it's challenging in that they're, in a way, so episodic. The main character, Antidotes, has all these encounters in fairyland that can seem disconnected or disparate, kind of what's the meaning of all of these, but there's so much wealth there for visual storytelling that we knew it would be a really fun experience for the illustrator. And when we talked with Meredith about which MacDonald work and what she thought about Phantastes, she kind of took a little retreat for a couple of days to sit with it and some of MacDonald's other writings, and came back and said, I think I've figured out kind of how to have a through line thematically, even as Antidotes is encountering having these one-off encounters with various characters. And then there are a few that do show up multiple times. So that was also an interesting aspect to the story, this combination of both one-time encounters that you never see that character again, and a few that do return and are part of his overall journey through fairyland, which in a lot of ways is kind of a spiritual journey into maturity and into truth.
Yeah, and I will totally echo what you were saying with how this lends itself well to the visual medium, because I was just reviewing some of the early artwork you sent me, and I looked at like the first page, and it was Antidotes walking through a garden with fairies around it, and I was just thinking, yes, this is a perfect medium for this, because Phantastes is, I mean this in a very complimentary way, weird, it is challenging, and one of the challenges of the reader, it's just hard to wrap your brain around what's going on, and having the visual element there, I just think is really, really useful in getting that through line. So let's go back to Meredith Finch, because I'm really impressed by this sort of grasp that she seems to have of MacDonald. What do you think it is about her? What about her writing is able to capture the themes of MacDonald, do you think?
Well, I think it does definitely help that she is a woman of faith herself. And she's been writing in the comics industry for quite some time, so she has real mastery of the format. And that, I think, also is really key to just her being able to read a prose work, and one that is highly descriptive, and be able to visualize and then get onto paper what it looks like as a graphic novel. And I think it also probably helped that she did a lot of her own research, and as I mentioned, reading some of MacDonald's other works, and so understanding more about his own worldview, his own perspective, and what that he had written elsewhere was being communicated in Phantastes, just in a literary form, as opposed to in a kind of nonfiction theological treatise. So I think it was that combination of just her own faith, her own mastery of graphic novel form, and then spending concerted time reading, thinking, praying, and diving deep into his own worldview and writings to be able to grasp what Phantastes, which you are right, it is a bit of a strange work, but there's so much there. And we were just really impressed by her, how she took on the challenge of such a complex story and was able to simultaneously distill it down to a clearer account, but not lose some of the aspects of the original that make it as compelling as it is.
Yeah, and I'd imagine just her past work with the Light Princess, and I love the fact that she just sort of went on a retreat to just dive in, try to get around George MacDonald. I think that's great, and from the early work I've seen, I think that's going to really bear fruit in this. And one of the things you mentioned with Phantastes is, the world it creates, the intense descriptions, the pace of it can be very meditative in a lot of ways. I'm thinking there's this book that came out by Susanna Clark this past year called Piranesi, and it seems like she drew direct inspiration from MacDonald in a lot of ways, because it takes place in this giant labyrinth with these giant statues, and the main character sort of wandering about them. And it's the same effect where it's like, at first you're reading it and you're like, I have no clue what's going on. This is so weird. And then you just sort of get the rhythm of it. You find yourself just sinking into it. And it's just such an incredible experience doing it. So on the issue of the sort of meditative aspect and adapting that, how did you get the two illustrators for the work? So the two illustrators, Christy Norrie and Jess Taylor, how did they get connected, and what do you think they bring to the project?
Yeah, so we started with working with Christine. Goodness, it's been over a year ago. It was pre-COVID, and we found her actually through a contact within the comics industry. He has been a really important strategic advisor for us overall on several of our projects, but also on the company generally. And he knows a ton of people within the industry. And we knew that for Phantastes, we needed a really unique illustrator. And Christine has worked in graphic novel form and sequential art. She also had done quite a bit of just traditional book illustrating and had more of a fine art background. And that really appealed to us, knowing that she could bring a real sophisticated style. We knew that we did not want Phantastes to feel cartoony, and we didn't even want it to be similar to The Light Princess. The Light Princess is, in a good way, a somewhat Disney-esque aesthetic. It's just beautiful, but a little more kind of, it feels like animation. And we wanted something that felt more artistic and a little older, because certainly Phantastes skews older in terms of age demographic. And so Christine's portfolio and background and skill set was just exactly what we needed. And she was enthusiastic about the project and being involved. So we got started with her, and she has done the artwork for the first 3 chapters, the 6-chapter novel overall. And when the pandemic hit, we ended up having to just put a pause on the project until we figured out kind of what's happening with COVID and what the overall prospects were going to be for the completion and distribution of the novel. So now that we've resumed work on it, at the halfway point, Antidotes crawls through this tunnel and emerges in a new section of Fairyland. And so that's where we're pivoting to another illustrator, because unfortunately Christine has moved on to other projects. So it's fortunate for her, unfortunate for us. but it's going to give us the opportunity to introduce a second aesthetic, which we're excited about, and to work with a new illustrator. And we are hoping that things will work out to work with Jess. Right now, we're trying to confirm that her schedule and availability fits our time frame for delivery. So if not her, it will be someone else that has a similar just background, pedigree, portfolio in terms of being able to bring a sophisticated fine art approach to the artwork overall. Because one of the things that we love best about what Christine was able to do in the early chapters is, rather than follow a traditional paneling approach, which you typically see in both comics and graphic novels, where it's either rectangular or square kind of layout on the page, she had a much more organic approach to the story, and the art just flows up and down and across the pages. And so it really ties in so beautifully with the journey that Antidotes takes overall, that he's going just from point to point throughout and exploring this fantastical world, and the reader really gets that sense, and it's captured very well in the way that Christine approached the overall artistic layout of the visuals in the story.
Yeah, and again, I can echo that based on, the early things I've looked at. First of all, in terms of the style, I really appreciate it because if any listeners are familiar with sort of the 19th century, like really fancy book panels or book illustrations, they're very intricately illustrated, or think of like a classic book about fairies or something from that. That was the look of it. And you can definitely tell the intention behind it in the research I went into. And I thought it was absolutely the perfect aesthetic. And like you said, it seemed to flow organically. And that is just so important for the kind of meandering nature of the work itself. So, yeah, I think that y'all have nailed it so far. And I'm very much looking forward to what happens next with it. So now let's sort of go a little bit wider and talk about Phantastes, the work itself. For any listeners here who are not familiar with Phantastes, first of all, I know where you're coming from, but go out and read it. You'll thank me. And I'll just sort of give a very broad summary of the plot, which is, like Mandi said, it's very episodic. So there's not really any intent of a through line through it. But basically, there's a character, a human named Antidotes, and on his 21st birthday, he discovers this ancient fairy, like an actual fairy, in a desk that used to belong to his father. And the next morning, he wakes up in fairyland. And he has all these episodic adventures. At one point, he's in a giant marble palace with all these statues. At one point, he's helping two brothers prepare to battle, a team of giants. He creates a lady out of marble and falls in love with her. The lady comes to life and runs. He chases after her. Doesn't get her in the end. Spoiler alert there. And I read this as a 21-year-old boy, and I was like, yeah, me and Antidotes, we're on the same wavelength there. We feel the same way. But basically, the plot isn't as important as the feel of it in my estimation, where you dive into it, you kind of go along with it, and you sort of let it wash over you. Mandi, do you agree with that? Do you think there's other through lines I've been missing? How would you describe Phantastes sort of in the wide scope?
No, I would agree with that. And I do think it's funny. I feel like Mere Christianity is one book that I know I need to return to multiple times throughout my life. As I age, change, go through different experiences in life, I know it's a book to return to, because it's always going, and scripture is the same way. It's always going to speak to me. It'll just speak to me differently based on where I am in life at the moment that I'm reading it. And I feel like Phantastes is another book on that short list of, I don't just read it once and say, well, that's nice, move on. Don't need to circle back, because there is so much that is just there. MacDonald has put so much into the story. In a lot of ways, I feel like it is an interesting parallel or mirror of life, because there are aspects to our lives that will feel very episodic. And certainly there are experiences that we have, people that we encounter, relationships that we have that may be for a season. And then you move on, and to some extent, you never come back to that particular moment, that particular situation, but it has instruction for you. It shapes your character, it shapes who you are and your perspective, and will be relevant and resonant down the line further in your own journey. And I feel like in a lot of ways, that's what Antidotes experiences in Fairyland. And certainly he's in this fantastical world. So what's happening there is not, what's happening for real back in Victorian England, where he's actually living a human life, but he's having this, essentially this spiritual journey, this spiritual experience in Fairyland that does shape his character. It shapes his soul, and it does shape who he is when he emerges back into the real world, and in a lot of ways kind of establishes him for the rest of his life. And I think we all have similar experiences just within our respective spiritual journeys. We have seasons of life and experiences that shape us in ways that no one may see, but it's nonetheless real, if not more real, and then has an impact and bears fruit throughout the rest of our lived lives. So I would say that it's the story overall is a really interesting just parallel of generally. And so there is some real kind of resonance in the episodic nature of it, because certainly life has those aspects as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I certainly agree with what you were saying about it being one of the things you need to come back to. One of the convictions I've had in preparing for this podcast, thinking, oh man, I need to read this again. Last time I read it, I was like 21. Now, further on in my life, I think I'd get something completely different out of it. So I already mentioned relating as a 21-year-old to 21-year-old Antidotes, having the girl who turns him down for the hero knight. That's a bummer. But really the thing that stood out to me and that really hung with me was Antidotes wandering around the palace. And I had a hard time describing why that stuck with me, but it did. And each one of those different episodic adventures, I think, has different effects on people. So I'm curious, Mandi, did any one of those adventures that Antidotes have stand out to you in a particular way?
Probably the two that come to mind most immediately. He meets a young woman in the woods carrying, hopefully I'm going to remember this correctly, she's carrying this crystal globe, and I believe that he asks her for it, and she says no, essentially, like, this was given to me, or this is mine, and it's kind of my duty, my responsibility to hold it, to protect it, to preserve it. And then he takes it from her and ends up ultimately, and spoiler alert, ultimately shattering it. And later, I think they have an encounter later, and the guilt that he feels over that later in remembering what he did. And at that point in his journey, he's already grown, already matured. He's already a different person, and has a real sense of shame having to face her again. And she's seemingly unchanged. I mean, she lives in Fairyland, so in a way she's ageless, whereas he has, in a sense, aged. He's had these other experiences that have changed who he is and given him more gravity, which was certainly a key theme in Light Princess, more gravity, more maturity. And I can certainly relate, as I continue down my own kind of life path and looking back to certain choices that I made as sins of omission or commission, that even though Christ has washed away that shame, there's still just that memory of, oh man, a regretful decision. And that definitely struck me, just seeing seeing how MacDonald decided to depict that is really interesting. And then he also has this encounter with an old woman. MacDonald does this repeatedly. Old women who, they don't look old, they look really young, or they look ageless, they look almost statuesque, but they're obviously old. You can tell in their eyes there's the level of wisdom. I find that interesting, the way he just plays with age and wisdom and what that looks like physically. But he encounters this woman in a cottage, essentially, a cottage with 4 doors. And he goes through each of the doors and has a different experience in each of those kind of worlds that he enters through the portal. And that's fascinating to me as well, that there's this kind of central hub from which he goes out and has very different experiences, but he keeps coming back to this same place. And each time he comes back in a different condition. He comes back with a fresh experience or a fresh memory kind of on his mind or weighing on him. And therefore, the interaction with essentially his hostess is different based on what he's encountered. And it's intriguing how often Antidotes has an experience of suffering or challenge, but another character ends up suffering alongside or bearing some burden for him or paying a price for him, which is certainly there's a lot of spiritual parallels there as well, both within just our relation to Christ and what he bore for us, but also bearing one another's griefs and burdens. So I would say those two probably stand out to me the most, just in terms of when I read it for the first time on my own and was kind of envisioning what was happening, and just those two really sticking with me.
I really appreciate the way you put that, where I already talked about how a lot of the plot seems, very episodic. He goes to this magical place, and he goes to this one, then he goes to this one. But the through line is the development of Antidotes and his spiritual maturity, the spiritual gravity, the weight, like you said. And I think that's very apparent in the story. And this is a story with kind of a through line through various episodes of the Marble Lady, who he finds a marble statue by Pygmalion, which I think is very significant here, just thematically, because Pygmalion, he sort of makes his own statue and falls in love with it. So it's sort of this woman of Antidotes' own creation that he falls in love with. Antidotes sings to the woman, comes to life, and then runs away from him. And Antidotes he's super in love with her. So he chases after her. She keeps running, and Antidotes can't take a hint, I guess. So that's a recurring theme where he's trying to pursue this sort of idealized object that he's in love with. But then he finds out later, again, spoiler alert, but come on, people. You should have paused it and read the book. He finds out later that the Marble Lady falls in love with one of the knights, this heroic Sir Percival figure. And after the initial feeling crushed about it, he develops this maturity toward it and sort of develops this sort of wiser view of it, where he's like, oh, my own personal dream isn't necessarily the most important thing here. I have this mission that's sort of different and doesn't involve that. And he ends up joining Sir Percival as his squire. So you can see the maturing of Antidotes from this sort of, this sort of juvenile, oh, I'm going to create this idealized woman and, fall in love with her or whatever, to having this thing like, oh, I'll go to Sir Percival, I'll serve him, and that'll be sort of this higher calling that I'm going to do. It's sort of this death to self and this spiritual maturity that he gains. So there's, again, so much going on in this story. So now I'd like to pivot again from Phantastes itself to the legacy of Phantastes. So as we've been discussing, Phantastes is not nearly as well known today as a lot of the works by those who are influenced by George MacDonald. Do you have any thoughts, Mandy? Why do you think Phantastes isn't held in the same cultural fame that like Narnia, Lord of the Rings, Alice in Wonderland are?
I think one is just because it's so challenging. Narnia is much more accessible Lord of the Rings as well, even though it skews older than Narnia. And I mean, Alice in Wonderland, it certainly has its own strangeness to it, but I think there's enough of a more kind of traditional narrative approach and this playing out of a kind of a single plot line that is more concrete and less allegorical, whereas MacDonald, and maybe it's somewhat a product of his time, Lewis Carroll was not quite a contemporary of MacDonald. Maybe he was just enough later vintage that he was already writing in a more modern, accessible style. But I think that's probably the principal barrier, is that it's much more of an allegory than just a fictional story. And so you don't have that same just satisfaction of plot where, here's the hero and here's the villain and the main kind of point of contention, the main conflict, and it plays out with the sidekick and the wise guide, all the typical, or at least archetypal characters and aspects of the plot. Phantastes just doesn't fit that mold. So I think that's probably a primary reason that the kind of modern familiarity with it and its popularity or lack thereof, it is where it is. And maybe it's to some extent, it has been eclipsed by some of the authors that he influenced. I mean, certainly Lewis and Tolkien being the exhibit A of his influence and of the just kind of fruit that was born in subsequent generations of writers. For Lewis in particular, C.S. Lewis in particular, I mean, he talked about how Phantastes was the story that baptized his imagination long before he professed faith in Christ, which I find fascinating. I think if I remember the story correctly, he picked up a copy at a train station, essentially. And I don't know if he read it in one sitting. It seemed to imply that he just read the thing kind of straight through. And it just totally revolutionized his perspective, his worldview, and to some extent his faith. At least it started him on the journey to faith. There was one additional step in his journey to faith, which I find fascinating. And Lewis and Tolkien both were so scholarly. So that may also be an aspect where they were both incredibly gifted writers to take all of the things that they had learned and studied and mastered and then taught, and all those went to the form of fiction that's much more accessible to a mainstream audience. MacDonald, maybe less so, is a little, I think, harder to grasp, a little more complex, and not as traditional or just conventional in the way that he tells at least the story within Phantastes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to what you just said. Absolutely. And I just a couple that sort of popped into my head as you were giving your explanation. I think you touched on this, but it could just be, Phantastes is older. Phantastes was published in 1858, so about a century before Narnia and Lord of the Rings and all those. And, the style back in that day was different. We can still appreciate it today, but there is sort of that extra level, this extra hurdle that today's readers need to go through. And like you said, Phantastes is challenging. It's not something you can go to for light reading. It's not the sort of thing you can sort of go in just like, follow the plot. Like by today's standards, by how they teach you to map out a plot in like fiction writing classes, Phantastes does not do any of that. And it's not trying to do that. It's trying to do something else that is more demanding. Even something like Alice in Wonderland, which, like you said, Lewis Carroll was younger than George MacDonald. George MacDonald was apparently kind of a mentor for Lewis Carroll when Carroll was younger. So, there's probably a few decades between them. But Lewis Carroll's work, Alice is great, but it's designed more for younger children and has like this levity about it that Phantastes does not have. So there are all of these barriers to it, which is one of the, again, go back to it, many reasons why I'm so glad you're doing the graphic novel adaptation of it. I just think it'll help bring it to a wider audience. But with that said, we just discussed the reasons why Phantastes can be difficult, can be, well, maybe not difficult. It's a challenge for readers. It's something that asks a lot of readers. Why has it still had such an impact? Like, why have so many great writers looked on Phantastes and George MacDonald as a master and as a teacher? What did MacDonald do right that had such an influence?
Oh, that's a great question. I will say, I think one thing for Phantastes in particular, maybe a perk of it being as episodic as it is, I think I can say this safely. A reader could pick it up, read a seemingly random chapter, and just sit with that. You don't have to necessarily get through the whole thing in one reading. One encounter that he has in Fairyland, and I incidentally just finished reading On the Back of the North Wind a few weeks ago, and I think maybe there's a few similarities there. At least early in the book, it seemed like Diamond, the main character, had a few of these encounters with the North Wind where there was some conversation back and forth, and it's like just that chapter on its own kind of stands alone on its own as a gem in and of itself, which is an intriguing aspect to some of MacDonald's fiction, where I would say for the most part, other books, other stories aren't like that. Maybe that's a constraint of a more traditional plot line. You really do need to read the whole thing from front to back to understand what's happening. With some of MacDonald's more episodic writing, you can treat it more episodically and just kind of take one bite at a time and sit with that, mull over that, and then move on to the next one. And maybe in the same way that Lewis and Tolkien were such scholars of language and of literature and mythology, and that really shines in their respective fiction writing, I would say probably MacDonald had a similar mastery of just theology and of doctrine, and his own background is fascinating. He had family members that came from several different kind of denominational traditions, a lot of different religious influences in his background. Even though he was ordained into a specific order, he had a lot of different influences that they also have helped form him as both a theologian and a writer. And I guess that's just evidence of when you've really mastered a subject, that it can come out in his fiction so beautifully and so well formed. And that's one of the things that just strikes me with all of the fiction that I have read by him. Every story, it's so clear to me that he knew what he was doing and he knew what he was trying to communicate. And it's like, even if I'm not quite getting it, even if he's beyond me, it's like, I know that you knew what you were doing. And I know there is deep truth there to be mined if I can just dig far enough, which is part of the delight of the challenge. And nowadays we live in such a distracted age. There's so much, the instant gratification era that we live in. There's so much accessible to us. It's much easier. We don't have to work as hard for it. So maybe that's another just constraint on MacDonald's reach and influence now. You just have to work harder. And for the most part, storytelling nowadays doesn't make you work that hard. And that's a poverty, I think, on our part. That's what we're missing out when we cheat ourselves of some of that challenge and don't stretch ourselves to kind of rise to the occasion and exert the effort and take the time to sit and contemplate and be a little more, I guess, meditative in the way that we read and then reflect.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight that you brought up. And it made me think of another part of C.S. Lewis's introduction to the MacDonald anthology. This is a really amazing thing that C.S. Lewis says. He says, I know hardly any other writer who seems to be closer or more continually close to the spirit of Christ himself. Hence his Christ-like union of tenderness and severity. Nowhere else outside the New Testament have I found terror and comfort so intertwined. I mean, my goodness, what a statement to say about an author. And maybe Lewis is onto something there. Like maybe, me reading it as a 21-year-old but if I were to reread it again, there are probably lots of things I would miss, but there's something there. Maybe that something there is just MacDonald as someone who, as a preacher, as, a deep and sensitive thinker, has this knowledge of just the human soul and just is close to Christ, so that maybe that just comes through in ways that we can pick up even when we're not quite sure what's going on the surface. So there's just so much depth there.
Yeah.
So now let's look forward to next steps for you. So listeners, I hope this came across in the conversation so far, but doing a graphic novel adaptation, this just seems like a huge undertaking. I mean, just between the writer, the two illustrators, coordinating everything. So where are we on the process, and how can all of us listeners help bring this process along?
Yeah. So Meredith has completed the scripting. So thankfully that heavy lift is done, and we have the novel fully scripted. Now it's just focusing in on the illustrations. So Christine has completed 2 of the 3 chapters that are kind of under her purview. We're right now working on the 3rd, getting that one finished. And then we will have a second artist, hopefully Jess. If not Jess, we've got some others in the running to the last 3 chapters. And they will just take Meredith's script and translate that onto the page. And it will be several months before we have the novel fully illustrated, because of just the stages in the process the illustrator has to go through and the level of detail. That's the kind of blessing and curse of a story this complex and of fairyland as evocative as we've established it, is it just takes time. But we are running a Kickstarter campaign starting November 4th to pre-sell the novel, and we'll be sharing excerpts from the script, sharing sneak peeks of the art and other project updates during the campaign. It will run November 4th through the 20th on Kickstarter. Although if you go to phantastescomic.com, you can link to it right there, as well as through Cave's social media. We're featuring Phantastes exclusively on our social media for now, as well as our website. And we'll run the Kickstarter to pre-sell the book and cover the cost of printing. And then once it is finished and printed up, we will be sending out the copies to everyone who's pre-ordered the book. And our hope is that we'll be able to do that in time for the anniversary of George MacDonald's passing next September. So September 2022. So when we announced the campaign on September 18th this year, and the goal is to have the campaign fulfilled at that time next year, and that's barring any major delays with either the illustrations or the printing. So that's our aspiration, and we're going to do all that we can to hit that goal, and would love for any listeners/readers to join us on the journey by supporting the Kickstarter.
Oh, awesome. That is absolutely outstanding. And so, once again, listeners, this is a huge undertaking that they're doing. And this is something I have sort of been mulling over a lot. It's, picking out the things that you think are important. Like, we talk a lot on this podcast about, good art and the value of good art. And, if it's valuable, then it's the sort of thing we should support when the opportunity comes up. And I can think of few projects that I think are more worthwhile just for me to support than something like this. So I will definitely be checking this out, and I encourage everyone else to be checking this out too, and support it. And hopefully we can get this in our hands before too long. And Mandi, thank you once again. Like I said, I really, really appreciate the work you all are doing at Cave Pictures. And hopefully we can have you all back on the podcast again soon.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. Well, listeners, as you all can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire's down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time.